Hello, I'm Rick Baldoz. I teach at Brown University in the American Studies department. Wrote a book called The Third Asiatic Invasion, Empire and Migration, Filipino-American History, and I'm excited to be part of the Filipinx Freedom School. I'm going to talk today about a couple of concepts that I use frequently in my work. One is empire. The other is sort of borders and sovereignty that I'm sort of using kind of as that sort of joint concept. And my interest in these themes is sort of born of just sort of, trying to make sense of the world that I grew up in. I grew up in a Indian reservation in Eastern Washington State with a large sort of Filipino immigrant population recruited to work on farms and warehouses in the agricultural industry in Washington State. So one of the kind of questions I sort of um, grappled with as a young person that sort of, evolved as I got older was why are there so many Filipinos in the United States? I kind of understood that Filipinos were sort of viewed as outsiders and immigrants. And the community I grew up in had a very large Filipino sort of population. So I was sort of curious, why are there so many Filipinos here? Uh, and the answer to that question I discovered was directly tied to the ascendance of the U.S. empire in the late 19th century. And sort of the second question, sort of in terms of trying to make sense of the world as a young person, was how to make sense of what I observed to be a kind of fairly rigid social hierarchy where I grew up, where whites were on top of the pyramid and Filipinos, Mexicans, and Native Americans were at the bottom of the pecking order. And sort of one obvious way of making sense of this world was that this was just the domestic racial and class structure of the US. And I sort of understood that as a young person and understood it a lot better as I got older. But I also came to realize that this hierarchy that I observed, this sort of domestic racial and class structure hierarchy, was also visible in the international arena, what I sort of came to understand as the capitalist world system, where the US and Western European nations stood at the top of the global order, and countries in the global south, including the Philippines, were relegated to the bottom of this social hierarchy. Um, and as a person sort of who sort of grew up as a sort of young, elementary school, middle school in the late 1970s and early 1980s, to the degree that sort of textbooks about US history talked about US empire, it tended to be portrayed as a benevolent or positive force, right? Something that should be celebrated, and that US kind of sort of global empire was initiated by altruistic American statesmen who sought to kind of salvage the territories that they occupied, like the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and to cure them of their backwardness, right? So this was a kind of unironic way of describing the sort of greatness of American empire, and that it was something that people should be proud of. And that was sort of what young people were taught in the public school system when I grew up. I came to be fairly critical of that perspective as I got older. And the more I looked into this sort of history of, why there were Filipinos in the US and where Filipinos fit into this sort of domestic and international global hierarchy, it became obvious that this sort of story of empire is a benevolent story, was a self-serving narrative that colonizers tell themselves to justify their mercenary behavior. So for me, my sort of baseline definition of empire, and I sort of mostly in my own work focus on US empire in the Philippines, is that empire describes a political formation characterized by a forcible extension of political rule upon underdeveloped territories without the consent of colonized peoples. And of course, I think a lot of people are sort of agreed that the aim of acquiring territories was to extract resources, to exploit indigenous labor, and more generally to elevate the prestige of the imperial states and to raise one's status as a global power within this kind of global state system. And I think that empire is a useful analytic frame, even in 2024, because it allows us to unpack the foundational concepts and institutional configurations of the modern world system. Right? Without empire, I think we miss a lot about how power works, who has it, and who does not. More specifically, empire as an analytic frame highlights how the institutional structures of empire and colonialism emerged historically, and also allows us to trace the consequences of these forms of domination and control for the post-colonial world, right? Empire after imperialism. So one, for me, important historical caveat is that the US was never able to fully impose its political control over its territories and frequently employed sort of hegemonic authority using socio-cultural domination to sustain American power in the colonies, even after the end of formal colonial rule. And just sort of one example that I think is familiar to a lot of people would be, as many folks are aware, the US currently manages over 800 military bases across the globe. There's not a single foreign military base on US soil. Right? So a key way in which the US projects its hegemonic power in the post-colonial age is through the kind of use of these sort of US military bases across the globe, engaging in all kinds of fairly obvious behavior, right? Sort of military interventions, but also using them as, the CIA black sites on US military bases to engage in all sorts of nefarious behavior outside the jurisdiction of sort of US law. So this sort of hegemony is sort of key way in which US projects its power even after the end of formal empire. So here I'm interested in how imperial structures and processes have catalyzed large-scale population movements, both in the metropole and in the former colonial zones. So one side of this story I think is pretty familiar to folks, right? Where the US has launched sort of military interventions, places like the Philippines, Korea, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Vietnam, Somalia, etc. We invariably see an uptick in migration from these societies to the US, right, in the aftermath of US aggression and the displacement and upheaval that goes along with that aggression, right? I call this a kind of recoil effect of empire. Right, so that's not a sort of revelation, right? We've seen a large kind of numbers of immigrants from countries where the US has had military interventions. But I think there's also, it goes the other direction. And I sort of increasingly sort of thinking about empire itself as a form of migration. And this is a larger way of sort of making the case that empire and migration go together. And I do think that we could make a strong case that imperialism itself is a form of migration, insofar as it entails cross-border traffic and movement, right, from the metropole to the colonies or the kind of targets of intervention. It involves settlement of outsiders in a new territory. Sometimes it's really large numbers of outsiders, right, settlers, and sometimes it's maybe a smaller group of military and government personnel, but they do settle, and how long they stay, is sort of case-by-case thing. And there's also, I think, claims to political legitimacy and belonging, right? Where the US intervenes, it claims jurisdictional rights to operate freely within another state's sovereign borders, right? So when it's invades Vietnam and sort of under sort of the guise of national security, it claims a sort of jurisdictional legitimacy. We can be here within your borders because we operate with a kind of what I call imperial sovereignty, right? Your borders are sort of contingent and revocable, yet our borders are not. So I argue that the projection of US power abroad has produced a long-term crisis rooted in the politics of imperial sovereignty through which the US has wielded its military and economic power to contravene the borders of nations and territories in the global South, while at the same time seeking to restrict the entry of migrants and refugees uprooted by these US intrusions. And I think that analyzing the tensions between U.S. extraterritorial ambitions and its increasingly draconian efforts to control its own territorial borders can shed light on why the U.S. immigration system has been a site of durable political conflict, highlighting how the failure to reconcile foreign and domestic policy imperatives has made the exercise of U.S. sovereignty as it pertains to border enforcement a kind of paradoxical undertaking, right? Violating other people's borders while at the same time claiming sort of that our borders are sacrosanct and inviolable. And it's important to note that the projection of U.S. power abroad has produced a sort of long-term crisis rooted in the politics of what I kind of earlier referred to as imperial sovereignty, through which the U.S. has wielded its military and economic power to kind of trespass across the borders of nations and territories in the global South, while at the same time seeking to restrict the entry of migrants and refugees uprooted by U.S. intrusions. This raises, I think, some important questions about national sovereignty as an organizing principle of the modern world. If that principle only applies to powerful states, then, is it a legitimate organizing principle of the world? And we might also ask if, sovereign control over borders is neither genuinely possessed nor enjoyed in post-colonial societies, why should migrants from these societies kind of honor the sort of sovereign claims of nations like the US or the nations of Western Europe that are sort of the former colonial powers? Why do we not think of, during the early period of U.S. colonial rule, why do we not think of U.S. military personnel as immigrants? Right? They crossed a border of another society. They stayed there for a long period of time, just in the same way that immigrants often come to the U.S. for a certain period of time and then go back home after they've earned enough money. Rarely do people think about, the U.S. personnel in the Philippines or in military personnel in Vietnam or the different sort of governing officials in these places where the U.S. intervened as sort of immigrants. But I think that's interesting. Why don't we call them immigrants, right? They're crossing another nation's border. They're claiming a certain set of, kind of political rights to belong, right? We can be here. You can't question our sort of right to be here. But when it comes to people from Vietnam or the Philippines trying to come to the U.S., there's this kind of sense of, you don't belong, you haven't earned it, you're an outsider, and your claims to belonging, even if you've sort of been in the U.S. for a sustained period of time, are illegitimate. So I think there's something interesting there in terms of how we think about what constitutes an immigrant. And I think that sort of this focus on sort of U.S. kind of military intervention, both sort of direct and indirect, whether it's the actual U.S. Army or Marines, or whether it's, the U.S. waging some kind of coup through the CIA or through these different kind of intermediary kind of multilateral organizations trying to undermine a government that we don't like or that the U.S. doesn't like. How come we don't think of those folks as immigrants, right? Even though they're in another country for a sustained period of time, shouldn't we think of that? And if we do, doesn't that kind of highlight that empire and migration go together, right? That U.S. interventions are a form of migration. Maybe they're not necessarily geared towards permanent settlement, which I think is what a lot of people get anxious about with kind of immigration to the U.S. But think about just the most recent example, or one of the most, there's many recent examples, the U.S. Occupation of Afghanistan, right? We know that famously, right, that the U.S. was there for 2 decades, right? So there was whatever 100,000+ Americans in the country of Afghanistan, a sovereign nation, for 20+ years. And we don't think of them as migrants or as sort of that their presence in Afghanistan is illegitimate, or that we should be, or that Afghanistan would be in their rights to build a wall to keep out the U.S., even though many people wanted them gone. So I think it's a kind of interesting question about how even the term immigrant is often, or sovereignty, are sort of instruments of colonial rule, right? Who gets that label? And their presence is sort of potentially illegitimate or has to be vetted and earned. Whereas sort of when the U.S. decides to cross the borders of whatever country for its quote unquote national security interests, their right to sort of contravene that border is really never questioned, at least not from the US side, that we can go anywhere we want, right? Your sovereignty is just a line in the sand. We don't need your permission. We can stay as long as we want. And I think that's sort of what I'm sort of grappling with in the new book project, is how to kind of put the kind of literature on kind of empire and that kind of border crossing in conversation with the kind of recoil effect of immigrants coming to the metropole, and to see those two things as sort of interfused and sort of part of the same process. One type of border crossing occasions a kind of return crossing, and that once that process has been initiated, it's very difficult to stop, right? You can't unring that bell. So immigration from places like the Philippines or Vietnam or the Dominican Republic or Haiti remain, kind of very intense, right? Because of the sort of long history of kind of cross-border movement, in particular with sort of US military interventions. And once you again sort of start that process, it sort of takes on a life of its own. In terms of sort of, I guess, graduate school training, the folks that really kind of shaped my thinking, one of the kind of icons of that part of my life was Eric Hobsbawm, sort of British Marxist historian who was really prolific scholar, wrote a famous, was it a trilogy or four-book series, including a book called The Age of Empire that was really influential on me, The Age of Capital, Age of Extremes, other great kind of work on nations and nationalism, banditry as a form of subaltern resistance, invention of tradition, a really kind of broad-minded scholar who sort of shaped how I think about the world as a sort of global formation. Another scholar who was really influential on me was Stuart Hall, a British sort of Marxist, I guess, kind of political, historical scholar, did sort of great work on sort of early cultural studies, even really kind of developed his own kind of intellectual operation called the Birmingham School that looked at sort of culture through the prism of kind of materialist analysis. So really influential, really his early work, The Empire Strikes Back, Policing the Crisis, those kinds of early kind of Stuart Hall works were really formative for me. And then another scholar who was sort of really shaped kind of more my early, kind of late grad school, early assistant professor years was Michel Rolph Trio, right? Haitian historian, really kind of powerful, kind of conceptual book about how we sort of, how historical memory works, who tells stories, who's sort of left out, and sort of challenges us to think more critically about sort of silences. I think it's called Silencing the Past, actually, the silences in history and how to sort of fill in those silences. So those were three scholars that were really kind of helped to shape my own thinking. In terms of some of the younger scholars that I think are really doing exciting work, one would be Katrina Kiesembung King, a historical sociologist at Northwestern University, is working on a great new book project that I think will be out in the next couple of years on sort of U.S. empire with a focus on kind of role of kind of U.S. militarism, both in the Philippines and the U.S., and is really kind of done some exciting work, kind of theoretical, kind of historical sociological work on kind of colonialism and citizenship, really exciting stuff. I like the work of Mark Sanchez, historian at Vanderbilt, who's doing a great new project on transnational solidarities occasioned by the US-backed Marcos dictatorship in the Philippines. Reading his manuscript for a workshop. I'm really excited about the innovations that he's bringing to this sort of historical questions and events. And then finally, Paul Nadal, literary scholar at Princeton University, doing a great book project on Cold War cultures of surveillance and extraction. Really kind of exciting, kind of theoretically sophisticated work that I think is going to really kind of blow up once it sort of comes out. So, yeah, three really great, kind of exciting young scholars who, I'm sort of waiting in the wings to see when this stuff actually reaches the bookshelves so I can engage with it and teach it in my classes.